Welcome to Intersections. In this episode, I interview my friend and movie director, Ryen William Thomas. Ryen discusses the movie Torn, a new thriller film that he directed. Torn tells the story of a troubled father who retreats to a small rural town full of werewolf lore in hopes of dealing with his personal demons. But he will first have to face the truth of his troubled past or risk becoming part of the legend. The film explores themes of shame, guilt, and addiction, and the role they play in our shared human condition, personally and corporately. Do we become the thing that we hate? How do the myths of our nation influence the way we perceive the world? What happens when we are overwhelmed with paranoia and conspiracy theories? All of this and more in this episode. You can find the movie Torn on Amazon Prime. Please enjoy this trailer before we sit down with the director.
You're not buddy. You know, all of this was for you. It was all for you. I tried being the best that I could be. I just got one little thing to take care of, okay? Just one little thing. I'm so close. And then it's just gonna be me and you. Be the light.
Sheriff Mike Lewis. You wouldn't happen to have noticed any wolves, maybe big game?
Actually, now that you say that, I have heard a couple.
Close by?
Yeah, it seemed like it could be close by.
Milford has more problems than a wolf.
What do you want him to do? Shut the whole town down?
I just want him to do something.
You. Whatever it is you're looking for ain't here, son. You need to pack your bags.
You want this town to be known for tall tales about werewolves?
You knew how dangerous it was, and you sent me on the trail anyway.
Look, you was never in any danger out there. The wolves, they never attacked anybody.
Kids, didn't I tell you to stay out of those woods?
Now, it's been a lot of years, but I can honestly tell you that there hadn't been a damn day go by that I don't still see them eyes.
I saw the same werewolf that Ned saw.
Peter, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave.
Well, state of mind. It's about that werewolf curse.
Spilling the blood of innocence? That's a dangerous, magical act. When you do it selfishly, any harm you inflict, it comes back to you sixfold.
Get out. Get out!
You don't know us. We don't know you. But you all locked up in here with your demons, and let you find what you're looking for.
Everybody's
Do it for your son. Get your hands off me.
Tonight's your lucky night.
Hey, Pete, you in there?
Hey, Pete.
So I'm here today with Ryen Thomas. Ryen, I'm really excited to have you on the show. This is my first time interviewing a movie director. In fact, I think you may be the first movie director I know personally. And I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and talking with us about your new movie. You want to tell us a little bit about the movie and what it's called and where people can find it before we jump into the conversation?
Yes, thank you for having me. Thank you, Dan. And it's a privilege to be on the show because I think I've been watching the show since your first podcast. Do we call it
Awesome.
show, podcast, episode? What do we call it?
It's a little bit of both. You know, I just
Okay.
launched into YouTube recently, so it does have that show dynamic, but I still have the podcast piece as well.
It's legit. That's what matters, and I'm a fan, so I'm nervous.
Thank you.
And
Same here.
so Torn. What's Torn about? Torn is a project that I've been connected to since 2015. It was brought to me by Jordon Alexander. Jordon Alexander is an actor. He lives in Charlotte. We've been working together for years. I met him on a set of a film called The Ultimate Gift. I believe that was the film. I was a production assistant or director's assistant. I'm not sure what it was, but it had assistant in the title. And Jordan was a stand-in. And we really clicked. I must have been, set production assistant because I was the one pretty much telling him to stand on his mark. And that's in film terms, that's when you want to be in a position where the actor is. So anyway, long story short, we really had chemistry. And after that show, I cast him in my first film, Sunset, which was made in 2008. And then another film called Nowhere, which is made it came out in 2016. So he was in that film. Two different projects. Sunset was more of a romantic comedy with like some elements, sprinkles of faith-based. And Nowhere was a psychological thriller, conspiracy theory type project. And he played a guy who was brainwashed. Spoiler alert for that film. But needless to say, we had a lot of chemistry and we collaborated on so many productions. So it just felt like second nature when he came to me when he asked me to direct Torn. Torn was written by him. He wanted to make it a project where he could shine as the main protagonist, the main character in it. It was a story dear to his heart. And he believed that I could tell it.
Yeah, and I think you did a beautiful job, and he really does shine in that film, playing that role and telling that story.
Well, I'll let him be the judge on if I did his film justice. He's an artist. He's an artist with particular taste. But we're still friends and we're still collaborating and we're working on our next project. So I guess something went right. But yeah, Torn. It's basically a story about a father in our age group who became a hazard to his own family. And because of that, he separated himself from his family. He thought that that's what he had to do in order to become a better man and become a better father. And so he isolates himself in a cabin that just so happens to be outside of a small town known for werewolf lore. That's where the twist is. And instead of going down the path of self-help, he gets caught up in the werewolf lore. He finds another escape, a distraction. And not only does he get caught up in an escape and distraction, but because this is a town's conspiracy theory, he joins in on the madness.
And where can we find that movie? I watch it on Prime. Is that the primary place our listeners could find that movie right now?
At this point, Amazon Prime is the best place, and so. But let's see what happens after this. We have some stuff in the works.
So I watched the film yesterday with my wife and was just blown away. I'll be straight up with you. I came in with no expectations, and it just far exceeded anything I could really have imagined about the film. It pulled me in very quickly. The film has a really great hook early on and just kept me intrigued the entire time. Honestly, I was surprised right up until the end. I thought that it was fantastic. I thought it told a really good story about the themes of shame and guilt and addiction. And it was just really, really wonderful. And so I just want to thank you and your team for putting that together. I think it's a movie that will speak to a lot of viewers. And of course, it's art, so everyone's going to take away their own things. For me, I really resonated with a lot of the themes, especially the themes of depression, the themes of trying to find recovery through self-help, the themes of feeling like you need to be separated, you need to get away. All of that really resonated with me. Now, even though I've never battled addiction, I've certainly battled shame and guilt and depression that stemmed from shame and guilt. You mentioned earlier that your first film was faith-based. Is that something you start when you started in the film industry? Did you do faith-based films? Is that something that still interests you, or where are you at on that now?
As far as faith-based film is concerned, it's because I have faith, it's pretty much just going to ooze out in everything I do. So I'm going to say the answer is no. I do not make faith-based films. I wanted to make films that I felt had heart in it and connected to my heart. And so, like I said, because I am a man of faith, it's going to come out through everything I do.
My daughter is currently at UNC Wilmington studying filmmaking there, and this is something she wants to do. She actually wants to be a director as well. So I'm asking this question for her before we jump into the themes of the movie. But what inspired you to make movies, and what advice would you give someone who's entering that field?
Oh goodness, that's a great question. So, she's how I want to go back in time in her story. When do you think the film bug bit her?
The film bug bit her. We used to go watch a lot of movies in the theater, and she's just always looked like, even when she was younger, it's kind of bad. We, as parents, we were always trying to find that balance for her because she loves to watch movies and shows, and she got into musical theater. She's an incredible actress. And she, I read her college essay, and in essence, movies really inspired her because she felt like they are able to take you to another place, to reimagine the world in new ways. And that's really what drives her. She just wants to make that magic for others.
So I don't think this industry is the most sane industry. It's crazy. It's almost like
Sure.
when you make a film, it's like the film does not want to be made. Everything that could happen to stop the film from getting made will try to happen. So the number one advice that I would give to someone like her is to remember that one aspect, that piece of that bug that ignited her passion, that inspired her. Always remember that. So no matter what happens on a set, no matter what actor cancels out a minute before shooting, no matter what food burns, who knows, a light falling on an actor, she will always remember what made her want to do this, what made her want to enter this mad, mad world. So I think that's the number one thing. And number two, regardless of where she goes, if she goes to school, if she continues school, or if she just jumps right into the industry, work with people, get to know people, develop collaborations, find your kindred spirit, because that will also help you. That will also help to get you through the madness. Because it is a collaborative business. It's not like visual arts where you could draw. You need a lot of people. You need a lot of hands going to creating that work. It is not. They like to say a film by. This film says a film by, but it's a collabo. It's a film by many. And so always remember that you're going to have to learn how to work with people. You're going to have to learn how to communicate. So regardless of if she gets a degree or not, study communication. Study how to speak with people. To study what makes people tick, human dynamics. You pull out any personality philosophy you want, Enneagram, Myers-Briggs. Just observe people and learn how to communicate. Because that's what you're also going to have to do. You're pretty much going to every minute by minute, especially if you're a director, your job is to convey your vision, and sometimes that will feel like a debate. So in the middle of that debate, you're creating a win-win situation, and you're also trying to remember what motivates you to create the work.
Love that. Thank you so much. I'm going to make sure she listens to at least, I don't think she listens to all my podcasts, but I'm going to make sure she at least listens to the first 10 minutes of this one.
Oh, I appreciate that.
So real quick, I also want to make a commentary on the actual quality of the film. The filming is amazing. The acting was amazing. I just have a real quick trivia question for you. The actor who played Sheriff Mike Lewis, is he related to Morgan Freeman in any way? Because I kept feeling like that was him on the screen. I kept feeling like that.
Let's just say there were so many times I was listening to the performance, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm directing the son of Morgan Freeman. And then I realized, and then it hit me, yes, I'm directing the son of Morgan Freeman.
Oh, really? Okay,
Yes,
awesome.
he's the
So
son of
he
Morgan,
is
but he
related.
does not wear that on his sleeve. He's going to
Sure,
watch this,
sure,
and the fact that I even brought that up, he says,
sure.
so
Well,
we
and I was
don't.
just
We,
curious because
mhm,
it was, and he was a phenomenal
mhm,
actor, obviously, in his own right, is doing his own thing and
mhm.
was really, really amazing. I love the way that he played that role. But I was curious, like the whole time I was just like, there's got to be some connection here. And I thought I would ask you that. So I
Alfonso
appreciate the
Freeman.
answer. That's
Alfonso Freeman
awesome.
is his name, and I met him I met him about, I think it was around 2016. So before we moved to my current house, we rented a place, an apartment, and he moved into the apartment under us. And I just remember the first thing I noticed about him was his style. He had this awesome hat. It was a great hat. And I knew that I was going to enjoy him as a neighbor. And we talked about the hat. We talked about possibly meeting, having dinner. That didn't happen because we eventually moved. But that was my first impression of him. Oh, and then he told me he was an actor. So of course, and I filed that in the back of my head. He didn't tell me his name. I just knew
Uh-huh.
I liked the guy. We had chemistry, and we're probably going to work together one day.
Okay.
And then we
That's
met
awesome.
on the set of a short film years later. At that time, I was like, "You look familiar," and of course, I'm not thinking you look familiar. You look like
Right.
Morgan Freeman. I'm thinking I met you,
Uh,
like
uh-huh.
you look familiar to me.
Yeah.
And sure enough, I remembered that he was my former neighbor, and he did an excellent job on that film. And that's the film that I realized who he was related to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it just kind of came together when by the time we did Torn, he was one of the faces that I had in my head while
Yeah.
reading all the scripts, all the drafts. I knew I
Yeah.
wanted to work with him, the guy that I met by my house.
That's fantastic. And it's a great choice. He played that role, I mean, just amazingly. It was
Mhm.
really, really great. So one of the themes of the movie is shame. The protagonist is obviously dealing with a lot of that for a couple of different reasons. And so I was curious, were there any particular influences, personal, cultural, or cinematic, that shaped your depiction of shame in this film?
Real life, because I think regardless of if you have the same addiction, the same monster inside, because that's what Torn is. It's about a monster, the monster inside of us. Everybody has a monster inside of them, um, that they're battling, that they're working to get atonement for. Um, everybody has that. So, in order to work on this film, in order to find a connection as a director, I had to tackle my own inner monster, my own inner shame. I'm an Enneagram fan as well,
Yes.
and I'm Enneagram 4. Enneagram 4s, they're in the shame triad. I'm sure because your podcast probably attracts a lot of people who are
Sure.
into the
Yes.
Enneagram.
Yes.
So I deal with shame. I deal with that. And it was not hard to find a connection to the character of Peter,
Yeah.
especially as a father. And the funny
Right.
thing is, I don't think I first came in contact with this script in 2015 around that time.
Mhm.
So I was 34, and at that point, I only had two kids, my older boys, Josiah and Quincy. Um, but I don't think I would have been ready to direct this film until I had a couple more years of experience of being a father
Hmm.
and
Interesting.
married. Mhm.
How do you think that informed? Like, what did that do for you? How did that prepare you to talk about this topic in this film?
Well, I think in the story, and as you're right, it is hard to talk about this film without spoiling things. But no matter what happens to Peter, no matter what he is searching for, what drives his search is his fatherhood, his son.
Yes.
Um, that's to return back home a better man, a better father is what drives him.
Yes.
And a lot of the lessons that I learned over the last 13 years have made me learn more about that, what drives me
Mm.
as a father. And
Yes.
so the more experience I have, the better I think I would have been to make a film like this.
Yes. Yeah. Very good.
I, I'm thinking about Steven Spielberg did a film called Close Encounters, made in
Mm.
1977. And in that film, the main character pretty much in his pursuit for truth and inspiration and enlightenment, he hops on an alien spaceship and leaves his family without thinking about it. And I think, I don't have an exact quote, but I think Spielberg looks back at that film and goes, like, oh my gosh, okay, I obviously made this film before I had kids or before I became deep into having kids.
Yeah.
Because I don't think I would have just left my family like that.
Yeah.
And, who knows, if I directed this film in 2015, I probably would have made different choices, similar inexperienced choices.
Right. That's interesting. Just a little bit of self-disclosure here. My father loved the movie Close Encounters, and I've actually never watched it start to finish, and I now feel like I need to because, my father had me late in age, and he was super nervous about having a child. And I'm just wondering now how that movie might have spoke to him. I need to go back and watch it.
I would love to watch it with you. Let's watch it together.
That'd
and
be
Interstellar.
awesome.
Have you seen Interstellar?
I've seen Interstellar, yes.
So Interstellar is my favorite film. And I feel like Christopher Nolan, not Spielberg, but I feel like in a way that's an answer to Close Encounters. By the way, I'm just pulling this out of my head right now. It's clicking. But I feel like that is an answer to Close Encounters because that film, yes, it deals with space, the time, continuum, all that. It goes back to his family. What happens with his family is what drives him in that film. And even though he does make the choice to leave his family for space, his family is what brings him back. His family is what keeps him tethered to Earth. Because it is Earth that he has to save.
That's right. It is, his family is the tethering post.
Yes. Save his family. And I believe, so I don't know if that was intentional. I would love to talk to Christopher Nolan to see if other alien films like Close Encounters played into that narrative. So.
Yeah, it would make an interesting dissertation for a film student.
It's just so weird how like I'm having all these ideas for dissertations after the fact. No one ever you can never write a good paper while in school sometimes, but after you see my text messages to you. I write papers.
Yeah. Right, yes. So in the film, Peter, the main character, is listening to self-help podcast, and he's doing this sort of as a way, early on at least, to fight these demons that he's fighting. And that initially resonated with me very quickly because I did the same thing when I went through a very dark depression back in 2019, 2020. And also for me, self-help was a little bit of something to fall back on. I had left the church. I was deconstructing. I had left ministry. And, in the context of faith and church and all that, we really didn't use self-help very much. And so, it turns out in the film to be a little bit of a futile endeavor, but I'm just curious, you have any experience with self-help, or, how did it shape you, or what have you used in your own personal development? You mentioned Enneagram, but what else have you relied on sort of as you struggle with your own demons and your own development?
So, yeah, I'm deeply attracted to self-help. And just like faith, I do believe there's another side of me, maybe in an alternate world, where I am a counselor or a coach, therapist, or a teacher. Those are the other jobs that I feel drives me. And someone pointed out, after we had the screening, the premiere of Torn, and one of my Enneagram coach pointed out that it's like I direct almost like I'm a therapist. So, and I'm glad that came from her. I would love for her to unpack that instead of me sitting here talking about, ooh, I think I'm a therapist. I'm not going to do that. But that does confirm to me that in everything I do is a form of, like I said, spreading faith, my faith, and spreading and helping others in some type of way of in teaching therapy. I think that's what I am. I think film may just be the medium that I'm using, but I am at heart someone who likes to mentor, coach, and teach.
Self-help gets a bad rap, and some of the criticisms are definitely valid, but it is something that I have found helpful, and especially as I've sort of integrated, coming back from deconstructing, finding ways to integrate that into my faith, have been really, really helpful. So shame is a deeply personal and often hidden emotion. It's people hide their shame,
Mm-hmm.
and people hide when they're in shame. And to some degree, the protagonist is doing that in this film. He's separating himself. He's going to this other place and trying to find, at least in my view, some sense of seclusion so that he can fight his demons alone.
Mm-hmm.
And he really does want to do it on his own, early
Mm-hmm.
in the film. Like, that's it. I noticed in the film that, like, before I knew what was going on, because the film is really great at keeping you tied in, and there's a lot of mystery in the film. And until I really understood what he was fighting, there are scenes early on in which Peter looks just beat up. Like, he wakes up looking like he's got black eyes, like looking like he's gotten beat up. And it was so funny, just an observation, is my wife, as we're watching the film, she says, "What's going on with him? Is he beating himself up at night?" And I thought, wow, more than you probably know. Like, yeah, he's beating himself up. So shame is, like I said, is a hidden emotion. How did you approach visualizing or representing shame in the film?
So he was like you said, mentally shaming himself, and he was definitely doing it sleepless nights. Probably before he even set foot into that cabin and heard the wolf noises. But also, he was going through withdrawal. That's another thing that we were working on with the actor.
Yeah.
But it was definitely a choice to have the camera a little bit more closer and have you intimately connected to him, like not distant at that point. I wanted you to be with him in his own personal madness. I rely on like inserts of the hand to draw the eye to his pain, his body language. I wanted to definitely highlight that body language. And on top of that, I didn't want to actually just come out and say why he has the shakes, why he's going through that. I want the audience to intuitively pick up on it on their own and come up with their own reasoning. It seems like you did too. That's one of the things I love to do. I love to, in a way, create what do you call those? I wouldn't say choose your own adventure, but I do love to plant seeds in the film, regardless if it's a thriller or not. I like participation from the audience. I like them to come to the table with their own experience instead of telling them what is happening. And that also goes to the actor, Jordon Alexander, and the script too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I love the way that cameras play a role in the film. I won't say too much about that, but that plays a role in the film, what's going on in the story. And I think you do a great job of that. And that, I love that you said it's kind of like choose your own adventure, because I was already creating a narrative in my mind when I watched this of what was actually going on. And I knew, because just some of the scenes early on and the way he's listening to the podcast and some of the things he's journaling and writing, I knew that shame was a big piece of that. And then later to find out that there's this addiction piece as well. And so in my mind, the way I see it is that there's this internal and external influence on how shame is affecting him, which I think is a profound statement on the human condition. Because shame is an internal, it's an interplay, internal and external, right? Kind of coming back to some Jungian ideas there.
I love it.
That there's sort of this interplay between the internal and the external. So how do you see that in the human condition, in terms of shame, or even in your own life? Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, what does that interplay look like? Where does shame come from?
Where does shame come from? For me personally, it's frustration. I have a very ideal version of myself in my head, where I want to go, a higher self, maybe have it, that I would love to meet and become. I would love to become more of who I already am. And when I fall short of that, that's when the shame sets in. That's where when the frustration. I'm not meeting my authentic self. And so that's where, for me personally, that's how I develop shame.
Yes.
And the inner critic and the voice in my head continues to beat me down and remind me of what's not happening, what's missing.
Yes. Do you feel like, though, that sometimes you're not giving yourself enough credit?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
But I just going back full circle. The more sons I have 4 sons who look like me, the more I feel like I'm able to, as I help them, as I father them, as I coach them. Ironically, it honestly feels like I'm coaching myself. And so I don't know if that sounds esoteric or not, but
No, absolutely. It sounds, yeah. As a parent, I totally resonate with that. Yeah.
yeah. And so it's like, okay, as I'm real time while I'm helping them, I'm giving myself feedback. I'm giving my 13, 8-year old, 11-year old, 6-year old self feedback. It's like I'm going back in time and healing my childhood inner wounds.
Yes.
And so I don't know if I'm being generic or vague, but that's what's coming to me right now.
Yeah. And I agree with that. I think even in terms of depression, and this is something self-help helped me understand, is that a lot of the pain I was inflicting on myself was because I wasn't keeping the promises I made to myself.
Right.
I wasn't living up to the standards. And even today, it on a very like day-to-day type, level, if I don't go to the gym regularly, if I don't, do the things or whatever, then I start to kind of beat myself up. And it's because and some of that is warranted. That's how we grow. That's how we develop. And we're going to talk a little later about shame and guilt and what the difference between those and how they interplay. But I think that's probably where the crux of the matter lies, because shame and guilt can be good things. They can be valid things that we should be feeling to some degree, but they can also be crippling. And for me, that's definitely the internal side of it. The external side of it is I think the faith I was raised with, which was I was raised in the Pentecostal church, a lot of holiness type teaching. Even though my family wasn't super legalistic, that was the context of the church that I grew up in. And so it was kind of permitted, if you will, like legalism. It wasn't like we were totally against it. We didn't live our lives that way, but we also were part of a community that did. And there was never really any good criticism of it. And so I feel like there's definitely this external component and my Enneagram, as you know, probably lends itself to being a little bit of a people pleaser. And so then I'm often getting signals from the outside world on how I should feel about myself. And a lot of times I'm wrong about what I'm getting. I just shared a story with you earlier about a former staff member before we started recording that I had felt deep shame about the way things went when I worked with them, and come to find out a year and a half, 2 years later, it was nothing like what I had imagined. So shame in some ways also, I feel like, a product of our imagination.
Right. It's a product of your imagination, and we imagine all types of things. We imagine, we're 13 years old, we see ourselves as this filmmaker who wants to do this. We create this whole plan, this whole path to success. Well, in 2012, I was laid off from a job, and that was the beginning of several things that took me off the path that I visualized for myself. And of course, the more I was taken off that path, the more shame developed, the more imposter syndrome developed, the more I was not becoming who I thought I was going to be. But it was on the other side of that journey that I realized that I can't define myself by what I do. It's who I am, and who I am is connected to, this is a podcast that does dive into things related to God, so I'll just say it. Who I am is somebody created to connect with God. And it's about connection. And we connect to God through everything in life, through our family. That's what matters. So no matter what happened to me, the layoff, the new job, success, no success, no matter how much I fall short, I was always going to have that connection. If I lost my connection to my family, I have the connection to God. I have the connection to myself. Those are reminders, that connection. That's what it's all about at the end of the day. You can't lose that.
Right. And I think that's something, at least for me, that I've learned with age. We're in the same generation, and I look back, I wasted so many years in my youth worrying about those things, accomplishments and doing the things and all of that. Even in terms of this podcast, I've started and stopped it several times. And a lot of that's because I was at a place where I still felt like I wasn't doing. But now I'm at a place where I'm just sort of in this rhythm of life to where I do it when I can do it. And I do it because I enjoy it. And I do it with people that I like having conversations with, like yourself. And I do it because I want to do it in a way that maybe will help others and create some conversation. And so those things become more important to me than actually the accomplishments. And that's now as a parent, I have adult children. Used to have children at home. Both of my children are, my oldest still, she has a room, okay, but she's doing her own thing. You know, she's got her own job and her own life and her own friends and her own relationships and that kind of thing. But parenting adult children, it's really hits home because more so it's hard when you're even 30 to remember what it felt like being a teenager, you know, like, but the whole time you're a teenager, you think I'm going to remember this and I'm not, but then you get that age, you're like, oh, it's so hard for me to connect to that. But now as an adult, I really connect to where they're at in their 20s and in their late teens. And I see some of the same patterns in their life that were in mine. Probably they inherited genetically and also just by observing and living with me their entire lives. So I do see that. And I think that's an important conversation to have. You know, Shay, you talked about connection to God, and one of the main narratives of Scripture is, at least Christian Scripture, I should say, is that shame is an obstacle to connection with God. And of course, in typical Protestant theology, sin is what separates us. But when we look at the Genesis narrative, it's kind of interesting. God addresses their shame, not necessarily their sin. In the dialogue that follows the fall, if you will, they're hiding and they're naked, and God says, who told you that you were naked? Not, why did you eat that fruit? So God is more concerned with bridging that gap. And so shame does create disconnection, I feel like, especially when it festers and become toxic. Is that something that resonates with you as well?
Oh, yes, fully. Based off of from the Christianity, and then I've also been currently researching about Tikkun. It's within like mystical Judaism and things like that. That deals with what keeps us disconnected from God. It goes into that ego, that voice that continues to remind us of how we fall short. And when we're reminded of how we fall short, that creates a reaction. And so either we react in a way that keeps us connected, or we react in a way that disconnects us. If somebody cuts me off, how am I going to react to that person will determine whether or not I keep the connection alive to my fellow man and to God. So I love it. I've been studying the same thing in so many different faiths. So and so many parallels.
I think in the church we haven't done a very good job of talking about shame. We kind of conflate sin and shame because it seems like they're conflated in the narrative. But and to some degree they are, as we just talked about. Sometimes shame comes because we don't keep the standard that we've made for ourselves. And so obviously that would be sin to ourselves in the purest definition of sin. But we don't talk a lot about it. And, that's one of my struggles, especially with my tribe and a lot of evangelicals, is that there's a lot of teachings that do not aid in helping people deal properly and in healthy ways with shame. And in many ways actually forces shame into the darkness. And when something goes into the darkness, as we see in this film, it becomes quite toxic. There's a seed that's planted in the darkness that will eventually grow into the light, and it produces really bad fruit.
Thank you. I really appreciate this conversation and you connecting to the story like that. And you're just reminding me so I'll direct something, and I may not even really, even though I'm making it happen, sometimes I don't really learn from what I directed until after the fact.
I see.
And So, and that's how films, my projects remain alive. I'm always learning something. I could go back to old books. I just love it when I could go back to something that I did and still learn from it. And that includes stuff that I created. But one of the things that I'm noticing is that in the film, Peter falls short. That's one problem. That's one thing. But it's how he remains in shame after he falls short
Yes.
that I think brings out, that unleashes his inner beast.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
when we elevate the situation. So, okay, you sin. That's one thing. But what are you going to do about it? Are you going to change? Are you going to move on? Are you going to find a kindred spirit to help you and be accountable? Or are you going to wallow in it? Because if you wallow in it, then that's when that inner voice, that demon, that monster, that werewolf, that's when that voice gets louder.
Yes.
That's where, you know, if you believe in the devil, that's where the devil wants you. He wants you to stay in that shame.
Yes.
Because that's where the trouble really happens.
Yes. And in that way, I feel like sometimes, at least in my experience, I've seen the church be a vessel of Satan more than of God.
Ooh.
Yeah.
What is this? What's this? Is this a...
Yeah. So I'll give you an example of this. I pastored a church in Nashville, and I had an elder, literally age-wise and spiritually wise, who attended our church, and I adored him. He was very forward-thinking, very open-minded. But one day in passing, I'd made a statement in a sermon that somehow, at the time, made him feel like I was making a statement about homosexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And so the next Wednesday, even though it wasn't explicitly so, he interpreted it that way. The next Wednesday comes to church, and he brings this article with me, and it has all these statistics about the suicide rate among people who are in LGBTQ community, etc. And he says, "You're telling me you think that this is okay?" And my response to him was, I think the error that is often made is that the sin is what is causing that problem, or that sort of psychological reaction. But has he ever considered that maybe that happens because society and the church wants to keep them in the darkness, wants to relegate them outside of the community, wants to shame them, and that the shame is actually what is creating these sort of suicide statistics, these sort of depression statistics. It's not the thing, it's the shame that we put on the thing that is actually doing psychological damage. And it's one reason why I've landed being more open and affirming in my faith, because I have personally seen among many of my peers and friends the psychological effects that shame has on them, shame that they've received from the church about something, or just their personhood, if you will, and
that evil eye.
It's really toxic. Yes, yes. And so, anyway, that's just a little aside observation on shame in the church.
So one of my favorite scenes in The Birds, Hitchcock's The Birds,
yes,
is, and that's one of the inspiration for Torn.
Okay.
Is when the main characters, they're basically huddled up together in this diner, while the birds start to escalate their attack outside. So you have this diner filled with all these people, the townspeople, wondering what's happening. You know, and they all have their conspiracy theories. They all have their answers, their philosophy. They all approach the problem based off of their experience. And you don't know what truth is.
Right.
But I notice things don't hit the fan in that film until people get caught up in shame, until people start shaming other people. It's
right.
in the film, Tippi Hedren plays a woman who comes from the outside. She comes from San Francisco. San Francisco has all types of West Coast values.
Right.
And she brings those values to this small town, and she tries to penetrate this bubble with her outsider values.
Yeah.
Pretty much just like how Peter enters the small town in Torn.
Yes.
Yes. And I noticed that things escalated when all the characters look at them as the outsider, and when all the characters shame them, and then of course that triggers that evil eye. That makes them, that
Yeah.
escalates how that mirrors back how they already see themselves. So
Yes.
it's like everything plays a part in the monster growing. How we look at
Yeah.
ourselves, how society looks at us, and how we get caught up in what society says. This is why it really helps to really do the inner work and define yourself and stay firm on that, because everyone else will try to define you.
That's a good word. Yeah.
So I don't know how I'm circling around to get back to that
That's a good
point,
word.
but
Yeah.
yeah.
No, that's good stuff. And that's actually a great comment to lead into my next question I have, next conversation I think would be good. We'll talk a little bit about addiction. So the setting for the film, as you just said, the protagonist moves to this small rural town, and the town
See
is
if I have the
dry.
book back here.
Okay.
Bilford. Yeah. I see what's on your wall, by the way. You have comic books. Superman.
Yeah.
I'm a huge
This is
Superman fan.
this is my well, you know what's funny? The Superman uh plaque back there was actually a Christmas gift from my oldest daughter years ago
Oh,
when she's a little girl. Yeah, but I do love
okay.
Superman. My dad was a big Superman fan. We used to watch all the Superman movies together. When I was young, I had I still do, just incredible ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to drive my father mad because my dad really liked movies and he would try to watch these movies with me. But what would happen is I would watch a little bit of the movie and then I would go to my room and start role playing the movie. Like if I was watching Batman or whatever, I would just go to the room and start playing out my own imaginary. And it used to drive him nuts. He'd be like, come back and finish the movie. Superman is one of those movies though that I did watch with Dad, that I remember watching, and I don't know why it kept my attention. Maybe I watched it at a different time in life. So yeah, that's kind of where that comes from. And of course, then this over here is Master of the Universe, and that's actually signed by the colorist for the new comic series
Oh.
of Revelation. But yeah,
Seems like you're a visual storyteller. See, that's what I'm saying. Film is just the medium. You're a visual storyteller. You tell stories through when you're preaching.
yes.
And it all starts it goes back to your experience with Superman as a kid, with your father. Everything all comes into, how old were you when this happened, by the way?
Oh, watching Superman with my dad,
Yeah,
I would
probably.
say I was probably 9, 10 years old at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think I was around 10 when the death of Superman happened. That was my first Superman comic book, and that's
Yeah.
when it all
Okay.
started. Around the time I got bit by the film bug.
Yeah.
And so I noticed your background. This isn't my background.
Okay,
Bilford.
great.
Yeah,
Yes,
this is
from
the
the
book.
film.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah.
Bilford
You
Legends,
mentioned
Mando
you
Lewis.
mentioned what is it? ADHD. What is it? So
Yeah.
I could be
Yep.
all over the place, but
You're right. Yeah,
yeah,
you had squirrel. You're like, oh,
yeah,
rabbit.
squirrel
There's a book
moment.
back here.
Yeah.
So the setting for the town is that the town is dry. And for those of you who don't know what dry means, is it means that they don't sell alcohol. And it's interesting that the character goes there. He's dealing with some addiction, alcohol, and that kind of thing. So I'm curious, what role does the environment or society play in the characters' struggle with addiction? Like, is there a broader commentary you're making with this setting, or that the film is making with this setting, about the role or that environment and society plays?
Well, it's
in
more
the character's
about,
struggle?
yes, there's a commentary, but it's also more about the question. So I mean, like, will isolation help you? Do you sometimes need to get away from the noise in order to heal? Or do you need to be around kindred spirits and learn from them to help? Like, did Job do better when he was by himself, or did Job do well when he was with his friends?
Right.
That's debatable, even. Some of his friends beat
Right.
him down and made the problem worse.
Hmm.
And Torn, I do believe he found a friend, or at least he found somebody that wanted to be his friend. What that turns into, I don't want to say because that will spoil things. But the point is,
Right.
he finds a friend in that film, someone who wants to help him. And Peter's main question is to himself: will I open myself up to allow that person to help? And I think, regardless of whether or not you believe isolation is the way, or hanging out with people is the way, partying, I think you do have to look around and see if the answer is with you, around you. If there are people there who really want to help you, and be open to that. Try to find a way to overcome your bias and let your guard down to let other people in, like true people who want to help you.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes we don't know everything. In isolation, we may think we know everything. We may have the podcast, but we choose the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is like we're curating our own story. We stay
Mm-hmm.
in our head. We stay in our box sometimes when we're by ourselves. So while I could be withdrawn, I could be introverted, but sometimes you do have to let your guard down and open up and let somebody else in, because they could bring to the table something you didn't even think of, something that may help you.
Yeah.
And Torn, we have a character, and I don't put the backstory out there, but let's just say he comes from the big city, and you have these characters saying, "Let's go hunting," and he's like, "Okay, never did that before," and he does. And I believe that situation does help him in the story. I believe he does get something from his interaction through these other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really great, and that also is a little bit of a commentary on the 12-step program, which works for a lot of people and is featured in the film as well. That you do need someone else, and so there is this kind of interesting contrast in the story where his intention is to solve this on his own, which is very apparent with the help of a podcast. And I guess this is something I've experienced as well. You talked about Job, which was better in isolation or with his friends, and I guess there's a little bit of both. And I know when I was really going through depression and kind of coming out of it, a lot of the work I just did in isolation because I was too ashamed to really talk about it with other people. But at some point, other people became necessary. And so I think that we do live in an age now where everything is very accessible digitally. And sometimes we rely on these digital formats maybe a little too much to solve some of the issues socially and personally. But there is something to be said about that human connection, that interpersonal, whether it's just on a counselee type level, or maybe even more important as friendship. And that's a whole, that's a whole nother topic. But like, I can't remember who it was in the 70s said we're entering the therapeutic age, and made the criticism that people will pay for friendship now and call it therapy. And
we're going to have to talk about that. Maybe if not here, we're going to have a sidebar. That's good.
Yeah, well, we can definitely have a sidebar because I think it definitely relates. And so I think we see a lot of that now. People are isolated and they just are outsourcing friendship.
And the pandemic just escalated that, huh? We made this film partially in isolation, it feels.
Interesting.
Yeah, because this is the first project that I worked on where the casting session was done digitally. So it does have that element to it. I just had a hard time getting through pre-production because I couldn't. I rely on chemistry, and so it's just sometimes hard to cast and interview people through a screen because I need to know how I'm going to feel with them on the set when the madness happens. And so we found locations through a computer. Everything was done. And
you were even reaching out. You were even reaching out to me trying to find places.
Yeah,
like you were contacting all your friends.
Pre-production happened on my phone, and so
wow.
Yeah, and so there were a lot of, even though it was Jordon, I was working with Jordon and the producers. There were a lot of moments that I felt alone because I didn't have that. It was all made by myself.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts on the therapeutic age being a time where people pay for friendship?
Oh, one thing, it's easy to become friends with a coach. And when your time is up and you no longer have any sessions with that coach, the loneliness really sets in because it's almost like you have no friend. You have no one else to go to.
Right.
And so that's when it really hits home that, oh my gosh, how much the voice comes back like, did that person even know me? They're just leaving me hanging. I feel abandoned. Imagine if abandonment is a contribution to your shame and you no longer have a coach to talk to.
Right.
So I was also speaking to a
Yeah.
coach during the pandemic, the lockdown, while working on
Hmm.
Torn. So it is funny,
Hmm.
all this happened at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was actually doing a therapy with a Jungian psychotherapist during that time as well.
Mm,
Um, and I think so. One of the things, as you were talking, that kind of occurred to me about that criticism, which I think is a fair criticism to some degree,
mm,
um, is that in the counselor coach relationship, it's very transactional,
mm, mm,
and I think people find safety in transactional relationships,
mm,
um, because the expectations are known. You pay the money, you get the time, and you see this in all sorts of ways as it's played out. Just culturally,
mm,
there's Chris Hedges wrote the book Empire of Illusion, and he goes through like all these different things in our society that are sort of illusions, if you will. And one of the ones he talks about is the illusion of relationship, and he does this whole expose on the pornography industry, for instance. But I think that's one example, but there are multiple examples in which I think sometimes we prefer the transactional relationship than the real relationship. I do real estate, and that's one of the things my CEO is big on, is that the relationship can't just be about the transaction. It has to go before that and after that. Like you genuinely care about people. But I know when I was really in a dark place, that was hard for me, and so I just would have preferred transactional relationships. I actually remember
It's
telling my
safer that
counselor
way
that. Yeah, yeah. I
because it
literally
keeps you
told my
distant.
therapist that.
You're
Hmm.
still isolated in a way. You still keep yourself
Yes.
in isolation. You could
Hmm.
easily just hang up the phone or not call that person back.
Right.
But like connection with a person, sometimes that person won't go away
Hmm. That's
unless you
right.
jump
Yes.
by yourself. And so
Yes.
that person may not, sometimes that person will tell you what you don't want to hear.
Yes.
Unlike a podcast that may tell you
Hmm.
what you want to hear because you found the
Yes.
podcast.
That's right.
And
Yes.
in the situation, bringing it back to Torn and Peter. Um,
Yes.
and the movie Torn, Alfonso Freeman's character, Sheriff Mike,
Hmm.
he tells Peter a lot of things that he does not want to hear.
Yes. Yes.
And it's Peter's reaction to that that either keeps him on the road to actually genuine help or feeding into the monster. So
Hmm.
you'll have to watch the film to see what happens. But yeah.
Yes. 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 Okay, so let me ask you a question here so you see where this goes, see how we can hash this out.
Mhm.
Do you see a difference between guilt and shame?
This is a great question because I'm in Enneagram groups, and this is one of the things that we talk about a lot. And I don't
Okay.
even know if I have an answer because
Okay.
I'm still pondering, I'm still processing.
Hmm.
I think they're like twins.
Okay.
They come from the same womb, but they come from the same wound. So both.
Yes.
I think
Okay.
they come from the same place. Um, they could travel together, but they still are their own. They have their own identity, their own traits and quirks. Um, that's a very good question.
That
What do
sounds
you
great.
think? That
Well,
probably you listen to you will probably help me figure out where I think right what I think right
well, maybe let's try this on for size and see how it feels. I agree with you. I think that they're intertwined.
now.
Um, they're very tangled, and I don't think we can necessarily talk about them separately.
Hmm.
One affects the other, kind of back and forth. There's a tension there. Um, I don't know. As someone who has dealt with sort of chronic guilt,
Hmm.
one of the things I learned in therapy, and this is like my first round of therapy when I was in my 20s, and I was talking to my therapist about this, and he sort of pressed me on the question of, but what did you do wrong?
Hmm.
And his sense was that guilt is really only appropriate when you've done something wrong. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
Whereas shame is sort of an internal and external sort of rudder on the ship, if you will. It's kind of pushing and pulling you to do
Right.
the right thing. But
Hmm.
guilt then emerges when you feel like you've done the wrong thing.
Guilt is I think maybe a judgment comes with guilt. I think guilt also deals with the
That's good.
past. Guilt is something that's related to what happened. Shame is something like you said, that push pull. It's that voice. It's something that's always there. And Shame is something that makes you feel. Shame is something that keeps that guilt alive. Whatever happened in the past, shame is what keeps it alive.
Yes.
And I think you do have a choice. You could be forgiven with guilt, and you have a choice not to cave in with shame. I don't know if I'm just talking, but
I think that's true. And
shame is about what's happening now in this moment and what can happen in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the film, I think, tells that story very well. And that's why I encourage our listeners to go and watch the film, because sometimes you can only understand things narratively.
Mm-hmm.
But I see that playing out in the film, because in the film there are certainly things, not just the protagonist, but others should feel guilty for, things that are going down, things that they're saying, ideas that they're spreading even, that are condemnable, I guess is the word, that do deserve some sort of judgment, if you will. So yeah, I think that's true. And I think now that when you were talking through that, I also was thinking that, I don't know how to say this, how to articulate this, but like I was saying earlier, shame is sometimes something that we create our own judgments based on.
Bingo.
Like we judge ourselves. And that's where the guilt comes in, is when we make a judgment on ourselves based on the shame that we're feeling.
Yes. I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
It's kind of like when you're a kid and you do something wrong, or you think it's wrong, and you're like, oh God, I hope my parents don't find out, because this may not be right, or this, and you kind of carry that. And then when you get busted and it was wrong, you're like, then
shame is what makes you feel. Sorry, I jumped on. Shame is what makes you feel naked. Shame is what made Adam and Eve feel naked.
Yes.
Did we talk about Adam and Eve for the show, or was it before the show?
It was in the show. We talked about
shame is what makes what made them feel naked. And guilt was just going to happen. Guilt was just part of. It was a cause and effect. So they were going to feel guilt, but shame is what made them. I think living in shame, is what made them not accept responsibility for their action.
That's good.
Like Peter in the story in Torn.
Yep.
Can you imagine if they accepted responsibility for their action, what would have happened? Death did not happen after they ate the fruit. It was after they failed to accept responsibility for their action. That's when things escalated.
I like that.
When they played the blame game.
Yeah, I like that take. That's very good. Yeah, that's a solid analysis. So let me say that again. So shame oftentimes pushes you to not take responsibility for your actions.
It's a crutch, actually.
A terrible crutch. It makes you sick and terrible. Makes you feel terrible.
Right.
And I think that and that's, taking personal responsibility, which is a feature of the podcast he's listening to early in the film. They talk about that. And there's actually, if I remember correctly, there's actually a segment in which the podcast is addressing taking personal responsibility.
Jordan is so good at planting seeds that get paid off later on. That's what I'm saying. You could watch Torn. Yeah, I directed it, but I'm going to talk about the writer. You could watch Torn and discover something new every time. And Torn was the first time I directed something that I did not write.
Okay.
So that's one of the reasons why I enjoy watching. I could watch Torn a lot, more so than my earlier work, because I'm still learning things from it. I'm still marveling. I'll still call up Jordan saying, oh my gosh, you did that. You did this. I just articulated it, but it was there. Yeah,
that's great.
Very happy to have worked on this film.
That's awesome. So in the story, paranoia also emerges as a theme, at least among the citizens of this small town. There is a legend / myth / conspiracy theory involving the werewolves and who it is, or if they exist, that kind of thing. And so paranoia in the story, one of the things I noticed is that sometimes it was hard to tell what was reality and what was perception.
Good.
The way the film is shot is that there's, and even so, I want to go back and watch it, because there's still some scenes where I'm like, did that happen, or was that completely imagined? And it's kind of hard to tell the difference. I think that's definitely relatable to where we find ourselves in this current historical context, where we also are confronting our myths and our legends, and we also see the emergence of conspiracy theories, of which I'll go ahead and say, it's like, was it Cat Williams said, there's a little bit of truth to conspiracy theories. That's why they resonate with us, right? Like it's not necessarily that it's all wrong, but it's the paranoia that they produce, and this believing in that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that a little bit, and then maybe we can discuss. I don't know if you're familiar with horseshoe theory, but
I don't know about horses, but you said Cat Williams, and so my squirrel mentality made me think of Save the Cat. Save the Cat is a book that a lot of screenwriters reference when coming up with story structure.
Okay.
And in Save the Cat, there's a part in the film, or there's a part in the story where it's the dark night of the soul. When all is lost, it's the dark night of the soul. And so bringing this back to our country, I do believe that we are experiencing the dark night of our soul. The dark night in our soul. The country, if the country is an identity, we're experiencing a collective dark night. Which is why what is true? What is fake? What's fake media? Those are a lot of things that's happening in the world. I was trying to work in the film. Very similar to that, one of my favorite films from The Birds. That was like that diner scene represented the world. That diner scene represented society. And so there were many pockets in this film where I was trying to do that. Where I was trying to crowd all the voices, as that town, Bilford, experiences the dark night of its soul. So I think I went around the bush. I don't even know if I answered the question there.
No, you did. No,
okay.
I felt like we needed to have a conversation about this, and I don't even know how to have it, but that's definitely a good segue and a good start to it.
Yeah.
Because I have said in earlier podcasts that we live in such an age of deception. And by that, I mean what you just articulated. It's sometimes hard to know the truth from perception. And just this past week, even, I read like these social media posts where somebody said, this person said that, like one of them was about a podcaster, and he had a guest on, and they were claiming the guest, had sort of endorsed Hitler or something. And I was like, that doesn't sound like something that guest would say. And sure enough, I go and I read the transcript. I'm like, that's not exactly what they said. That could definitely be one way it was perceived, but it's not what was actually said. And then even in terms of like the politics, people say, this candidate said this or this candidate said that. And then you go look at it in context, and you're like, it's not exactly what they said. It's a perception of
what
it.
is
And
true.
I think that, yeah, and I think that does cause paranoia whenever you can't. And maybe that's a product of, well, we're postmodernism now, I guess. But that's sort of a product of postmodernism, at least, sort of this untethering ourselves from the institutions.
From institution, tethering ourselves from, if our country, if the founding fathers were our parents, and we're now trying to grow up and become, we're like a teenager, or we're still a young country. I'm rambling, but we're still a young country. We're like a teenager or adolescent, a 20-something-year-old who needs to now figure out what is our identity? Who are we outside of the original intent, outside of what our founding fathers said?
Right.
Are we going to continue what our founding fathers started, or are we going to amend it? I mean, they did create amendment to a reason.
Right.
Apparently, we stopped, like we were acting like that doesn't exist. They knew that things needed to change based off of the time period, based off of the context. You mentioned context earlier on. I'm not trying to argue for anything except for the fact that it's okay to grow. It's okay to amend. And obviously, we are having a national discussion on what our identity is. Let's figure that out with an openness to at least grow.
Yes. Yeah.
I know that's not pushing any politics, but I feel right now there's no openness.
Yes.
There's no listening to each other.
No empathy.
There's no empathy. Can you imagine if the characters in Torn actually listened to each other, how that would have ended differently? If they didn't respond to the situation based off of their own bias. based off of
Yes.
the voices and the monster in her head. Can you imagine
Yes.
things that film would have turned out totally different if they didn't consider the fact that maybe there are other voices
Mm-hmm.
to be heard?
Yes.
And yeah, I'm an individualist, so of course I'm like I'm gonna go back. You have to find your voice, yes,
Mm-hmm.
but when you know that Peter knew he had a problem, right?
Yeah.
So when you know you have a problem, maybe let your guard down and be a little bit more open.
Right. And you
And we have a
mentioned,
problem in this country. We all know it.
yes. And you mentioned, us being sort of like using that analogy of us being the children of our forefathers,
Mm-hmm.
and we're in that stage where we're finding our own identity.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that emerges in this film, and I think we can see in our society, is that every society has its mythologies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? We have these legends, these mythologies, and I'm not saying they aren't real. Okay, that's not the way I'm using mythology here.
Mm-hmm.
But the story takes on, typically a mythological story takes on a moral or cautionary import, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, we have some myths that have really shaped our society, mythologies, I should
Mm-hmm.
say. The mythology of World War II is a big one, I feel
Right.
like, because that kind of shaped the mythology of America as an empire and
Mm-hmm.
sort of the hero of the world. We have mythology attached to the civil rights movement. Anytime you talk about issues of society or race, immediately people are going back and drawing from the civil rights movement. And I'm not saying this is wrong. I'm just saying this is what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And then when those myths get challenged, it's very difficult. And even in terms of like looking at World War II and like JFK, if they ever release those documents, that's going to be coming out soon. That's another big American mythology. Those documents can be made public, I believe, at any time if somebody wants to do it at this point. But they won't, I think, because it may challenge the mythology. And,
Right.
and it's risky to challenge the mythology. But in this film, there's mythology that's emerging, and I don't know, to me it just spoke to me about the cultural context we live in. I'm so glad to hear you say you kind of you use that to inform the shooting of this film, because it definitely does a good job of doing that. What we see is the interaction of a society with its myths,
Yes.
and what can ultimately happen when that is not dealt with rightly.
You mentioned, so going back, you have Superman behind you. You ever realize that the movie, whatever Superman film is out, does a good job conveying the spirit of our country at that time? So the Christopher Reeve Superman movie came out in 1978 when America was experiencing a great awakening, when America was trying to learn that they could fly, believe that they could fly.
Yeah.
We just landed, we went to the moon. And now, Superman was all about that awe, that big, grand, great power, that took us from throughout the 80s. But then after 9/11, that great power got punched in the face, and its identity was challenged.
Yeah.
And I find it fascinating that we haven't had a good grand Superman film since. Every Superman film is marked with heavy polarization. They've made Superman Returns, Man of Steel. Either way, everybody is like, that's not my Superman. There's that battle, that civil war, because Superman does not know who he is. In the comic book, he actually doesn't know who he is. There are a couple storylines. And America, we don't know who we are. Everything's connected. Art. That's the beautiful thing about man, art, and connection. We all know this.
Yeah.
Torn. It's beautiful.
Yeah,
Rant
those are
over.
great observations, and I think that that observation of going back to maybe we're at a stage as a nation, as a society in America, where we're trying to find our own identity collectively. Kind of like a teenager would be doing in its teenage year,
Right.
in their teenage years, and going forward from their teenage years, and so. What happens a lot of times, and this goes back to addiction even,
Right.
what happens a lot of times is that when that process is not navigated in a healthy way, we sometimes become the thing that we hate about our parents.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And that
That's
emerges
it.
in the film. People become the thing that they don't want to be.
Exactly.
The thing they want to save everybody from, they become. Yeah.
Thank you.
And that's horseshoe theory. That's horseshoe theory. It's a political theory that the right and the left are just two different sides of the same horseshoe, and that the further they move to the extremities, the closer they actually become. So like a horseshoe, they become the thing that they hate, that they don't want to be. And I see that playing out in a lot of ways.
And because of how Peter struggles to navigate the monster inside, that just oozes out and impacts his society. So when Peter falls short, unfortunately, he brings other people down with him. And so, the whole sharing burden, unfortunately, you have to consider that. There's a lot of does it take a village? Sometimes it does take a village. And sometimes that village could all go down together.
So how do we do it?
I know that's pretty doom and gloom there, but it's a reality.
How do we do it, Ryen? How do we navigate it healthily then?
How do we navigate it?
How do we find collective identity in a diverse, individualized nation?
By first attempting to know thyself, and then also admitting to the fact that you may not know what you don't know.
That's good. Yep. I think so. And I think having conversations like this is important. We need to sit down with people and talk to people who are different than us, and not just about the things that separate us, but just about our shared humanity. I think we would learn a lot from one another if we would do that.
Oh, yes. Oh, this is awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for coming on the podcast today. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Oh, I enjoyed this. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about Torn.
Absolutely.
Amazon
Very
Prime.
Refreshing. Yes. Amazon Prime. Check it out. It's a great film. It's really, really worth the time. Take it and watch it. Share it with your friends. I think it's really awesome. Ryen, we'll have to do this again sometime, maybe on a different topic or maybe a different film we could just review together.
We talked about like 5 different topics.
We did.
Actually, 10.
And like 5 different films as well.
Yes. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the opportunity for me to show my monkey brain.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.